Live from London, I speak with the directors of 4 films: The Commandant's Shadow, Mediha, Invisible Nation, and Skywalker's A Love Story. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. A few weeks ago, we held our first documentary spotlight in London in front of a live audience, co-presented by The Ankler. On this episode, we share 4 of those conversations. You can find links to the trailers of each film in our show notes. Up first is The Commandant's Shadow from HBO. The film explores the legacy of the Nazi SS officer Rudolf Höss, who was responsible for building and maintaining Auschwitz. His name may ring a bell if you saw the Oscar-winning film The Zone of Interest. That was a fictional portrayal of Höss's family as they made their home on the other side of the wall from Auschwitz, where 1.1 million people were murdered. Rudolf Höss was eventually brought to trial at Nuremberg. The Commandant's Shadow focuses on 2 people who grew up on either side of Auschwitz's wall. One is the son of Rudolf Höss, Hans-Jürgen, who late in life is finally confronting his past, urged on by his own son Kai. The other figure is a Jewish woman, Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who was interned at Auschwitz and survived only because the Nazis enlisted her to play in the camp orchestra. Anita has a daughter, Maya, who carries her own trauma as the daughter of a survivor. Maya was the person who first reached out to the London-based director, Daniela Volker, and got this film started. After extensive planning, Daniela arranged for the 2 families to meet. Hans-Jürgen, the son of Rudolf Höss, would visit the home of the Auschwitz survivor, Anita. You can glimpse that meeting in the film's trailer. One striking image is Anita in her 90s, still a chain smoker. Here's my conversation with the filmmaker.
Daniela, today in 2024, when we hear about this film, a lot of our minds go to The Zone of Interest that came out last year. But you were working on this for many years before that. Can you describe how this came about, you making this film?
So I had a phone call. Actually, I got some emails from a friend who wanted to introduce me to a woman who wanted to make a film about her trauma. So I ignored them originally. And my friend was very persistent. So in the end, we had a Zoom call. And actually, it was quite interesting. One of my children was in the background. And she said to me, how can it be if this woman's mother survived hell, as she said, that the daughter, who was born 16 or 17 years later, feels traumatized by events she didn't partake in?
This is your daughter's asking this question.
That was my daughter, who was sort of 10 at the time. And I thought, actually, that's an interesting thought. So I started looking into transgenerational trauma. And then as I was going on sort of doing research on the internet, I came across an extraordinary document, which was the autobiography of Rudolf Höss, which he wrote before his execution. And what makes it so extraordinary is that he was both the perpetrator and the prime witness at the same time. And I found that no one had ever made a documentary based on the book. And then I found that Höss had a grandson who was roughly Maya, the daughter's age. And when I reached out to him, he too had experienced similar sort of trauma to the survivor's daughter. And it took me a year, but in the end, he did introduce me to his father, and I convinced him to, not just be in my film, but to actually, for the first time, really confront who his father had been, because Rudolf Höss was the architect and the mastermind of Auschwitz. And I kind of always think what's so terrible about that place is that someone imagined it and then put it into action. So it was sort of documentary gold to meet a man in his mid-80s who had never at all thought about his father, who'd spent his entire life suppressing any knowledge. So I gave him the autobiography. He read it for the first time, and you could see his reactions, as the horror seeped in, that, his father was the real kind of, in a way, the architect of mass murder. And then we took him to Auschwitz for the first time. And then there's this scene, which was quite interesting because Maya, the daughter, wanted her mother to come to Auschwitz, which, you know, in her mid-90s, is very difficult. And she's also very impatient. And, you know,
She's like, I've been.
yeah. She didn't feel the need to go back. But, you know, just even, I mean, in the film, it's only one day, but, you know, we filmed there for many days and it was all a nightmare. We were constantly running late. So just the thought of having Anita there was very stressful for me. But Anita refused to go. She said they can come to my house and have Kaffee und Kuchen, coffee and cake, which is very German. And I, at that point, got some funding. And I basically, this added money to, you know, the budget. So I had to go and absolutely grovel to get the extra money to bring the hearse to London. And yeah, it was extraordinary because Mr. Hurst had never met a Jewish survivor. I mean, he had people, as you see in the zone of interest, I think, who work in the house who were Jehovah's Witnesses or Polish inmates or political prisoner, but no Jews. So it was the first time. So he was shaking like a leaf. You know, I was sort of worrying. We were late. Anita's very impatient. You could see her puffing before they come in. Aggressive.
She is an advertisement for smoking in your 90s.
Yeah, if you want to live long, yeah. But yeah, no, it was incredible because she did what we do in our jobs. She found common ground, you know, by saying we were both Germans. You know, his father also won an Iron Cross first class in the First World War. So she established common ground with him. And yeah, she was very sort of generous and gracious. So actually, I'm really glad this happened. Because, you know, when I set out to make the film, I thought, well, maybe it's two parallel stories and they just never meet. But, you know, as I was sort of filming, each side sort of was asking me what the others were doing. And they became interested, actually, in meeting. So it was, I mean, it was a process, as many of our films, you know, it went on for years.
So you've been filming this, working on this project for years, and then did it come as a surprise to you that suddenly a fiction film comes out that is about the same family?
Well, it was a lucky coincidence because, you know, suddenly the Hearsts were like, you know, on everyone's lips. Everyone knew who they were. But no, I found out about them when I was in Auschwitz for the first time on this film. And they had been filming, I think they rented a house nearby, so they weren't actually in the Hearst house. And, you know, I thought, well, maybe I should reach out to them because perhaps for Hans-Jürgen, it would be interesting to see how someone else reimagines his childhood. But he wasn't really interested, you know, because he wanted to go into his house and his memories. So I didn't in the end. I mean, it's interesting because actually I think it really helps documentaries about difficult subjects to have a feature film, a fiction film come out. You know, it's
some filmmakers would be freaked out about that someone else is taking the story away. But
it's a different story. Yeah. I mean, they made a film about something imagined which happened in 1943 and 2 months of 1944. And I made a film about basically the aftermath, you know, the 8 decades that followed. And the fact it's something I had never really thought about, that, you know, you can have horrific events in the past which have like shock waves that lead into the present. And, you know, during the time, because I obviously have to earn a living, so I was making documentaries I was being paid to make. And one of them was in Ukraine. And I filmed a guy who'd survived an execution squad. And, you know, I suddenly thought, I mean, one day this man or his descendants might meet the other side. So, you know, it's actually, or if you think Israel, Gaza, you know, they are very transferable feelings. And actually, I won the Yad Vashem Prize for Holocaust documentary. And we had a screening in Tel Aviv where a rabbi and his wife came to watch. And then the next day, they reached out to the team in the hotel. And they were saying, this film really made us think, because actually we realized we don't know any of our Palestinian neighbors. You know, we live in Jerusalem. We've never met any Palestinians. So following Anita's example, they arranged for a charity to set up meetings to meet Palestinians. So in a way, when Anita heard that, that was the whole point. We wanted to make people think and reflect. And, Anita's big thing, she became a Holocaust survivor. She was a Holocaust survivor, musician, and became a Holocaust educator age 75 when she retired from music. Her big thing was talk to each other, because when you have a dialogue, you may find that actually you have more in common that divides us. So it's a film really about our shared humanity.
So I want to ask you a little bit more about Hans Jürgen. You described that he kind of lived into his 80s with, I don't know if denial is the right word, or but certainly a lack of digging into his father's past. Had never read his father's autobiography. Did he even know that that autobiography?
He claims he didn't.
Yeah.
No.
I get the impression from the film that he is embarking on this reflective period spurred by his son Kai, who is a minister. All right. So can you talk about like what you witnessed of that intergenerational dynamic of Kai getting his father to reflect on Kai's grandfather's life?
So Kai became an evangelical pastor in a Bible church, very American. He's in southern Germany, so his main congregation are basically U.S. service personnel. So he became very interested in the sins of the father, which go down to the third and fourth generation. And I mean, again, if it were fiction, you'd kind of go, that's a bit obvious, but, life always trumps, real life trumps fiction, I think, every time. So he didn't really know what to do, because part of the trauma is that actually the generations are very they really can't communicate with each other very well on both sides, I think. So when I came along, Kai saw it as an opportunity to get his father to open up and to talk to him. Sometimes
That's interesting. So it was something that was on Kai's mind, but having an outside filmmaker come could propel him in a way that maybe he couldn't have on his own.
Yeah, I don't think he would have managed to get his father to go to Auschwitz on his own. And it's interesting because, for his father, he says in the film, Auschwitz was the place of a lovely and idyllic childhood. So there is a terrible dissonance in a way. So you see, Kai and I kind of in a weird way collaborated because we had a common interest. Kai wanted his father to face the truth, because his father wasn't a Holocaust denier at all, but he just thought his dad was the director of a prison camp. And, he was executed because he was the boss, but he didn't really know or participate in what was going on. So in the film, there's the reckoning.
Kai is much more clear, saying my grandfather was the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, people say, what about Stalin or Pol Pot or indeed Hitler? But, they were sitting in offices in capitals giving orders. I mean, Huss was someone who just basically was told, exterminate many of Europe's Jews, work it out. And then he kind of had to create an industrial killing complex with an apparatus of deception as well, because, he didn't actually have many SS officers. So he had to make sure people got out of the trains and went into the gas chambers with as little disruption or panic as possible. So he writes about that very eloquently in his book. So I think those were the parts that really affected Hans-Jürgen, because it's interesting. I mean, he really did spend his entire life worshipping his father. It's almost perhaps like some weird abuse,
I mean, it's very fascinating to watch on film because there is a tension between some of these statements he's making, having fond memories of Auschwitz, but also kind of accepting a process of looking back that he has so far in life avoided. Even going to visit Anita. I mean, there is something that is, I don't know, hopeful about maybe a late reckoning, but there's still some kind of reckoning. How did you experience it.
Yeah, I think he knew there was something outstanding. I think he would have died an easier death had he not known, actually. But it was a very brave thing. It was the first time in his 86 years or however many, when we started, when he really thought, I mean, he had the option. He could just continue like an ostrich with his head in the ground, or he could accept this invitation, because I went to see him and I said, I'd like to take you back to the place you were happiest in. And, this time I want you to sort of cross the fence and see what your father really did. What the reason you were there was because your father was in charge of the final solution of implementing it. And, Auschwitz did become a byword for the Holocaust. So in a way, he could have said no. I mean, before I actually even met him in person, we talked a few times on the phone. He was always in hospital, so it was all kind of quite difficult. But I thought usually if people aren't going to do it, they'll say no straight away. And the fact that he kept talking and then he agreed for me to visit him, so you think every time you just push the door open a little bit further. And at the end of that visit, I said, I'd like to take you to Auschwitz to see, the death camp, and then to meet one person who survived it. And he agreed. I mean, once we were in Auschwitz, it was quite difficult because he couldn't really walk. And, the dimensions of that place are extraordinary. So I was very stressed the whole time, like, would he actually make it to where we had to film? So, it's kind of almost perverse, because you're in the most terrible place on earth. But all I was worrying is the drone and the contributor, So those are kind of the, I guess, the mechanics of filmmaking wherever you are.
As I finish this, I want to ask you, you were drawn to this because you knew that it was a complex and fascinating story. You've spent many years on it. What was your personal motivation to keep going with the story, and what were the things that you personally took in this in making this film?
Well, it's interesting because I'm half German, half Argentinian. So my German father was roughly Hans-Jürgen's age, and he was from a very Catholic family, nothing to do with the Nazis. But in 1945, when they were fleeing from the Soviet zone, he saw something which was so traumatic, it marked him for the rest of his life. So I sort of felt like I could understand Hans-Jürgen, and I could understand the things he couldn't remember because of my father. And I just thought, once I started, I mean, all these untold stories, because I'd filmed in Auschwitz before, we all think we know all about the Holocaust. And then something comes along, like this autobiography, which hadn't ever really been featured or made into a documentary. And you think, you get it from the horse's mouth. I mean, these are the unfiltered words before his death, when he really had nothing to lose, of the man who came up with all this. So it kind of felt important, actually. And it also felt important to acknowledge the pain and the silence and the sorrow that the descendants suffer on both sides. So I sort of kept going, mainly because I thought, this is actually an important subject and hasn't been done. I didn't feel it had been done in this way before. Because often it's just archive, talking head. I mean, here we actually have observational
This is
filming.
very much a story rooted in the present.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Story. So The Commandant's Shadow, it's been playing in theaters and still in the UK playing in some theatrical screenings still left. It's distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures and HBO. I want to thank Daniela Volker for being with us.
Our second film is Mediha, about the plight of the Yazidi people from northern Iraq who were taken captive en masse by the extremists of ISIS. Yazidi women were sold into sexual slavery, and boys were forced to become child soldiers. The film profiles the teenage girl Mediha, who is rescued along with two of her three brothers. We watch her trying to find her mother and other brother who are still presumed to be in captivity. The filmmaker Hasan Oswald put a camera in Mediha's hands so she could help tell her own story. Mediha premiered a year ago at Doc NYC, where it won the Grand Jury Prize. Here's my conversation with Hasan.
So, Hasan, I read that you originally heard about the story of Mediha. You were working on a different film and heard about her story from a colleague. What was it you heard, and what was it that made you feel like she was going to be a good participant for a film?
Yeah, so I had first heard of what happened to the Yazidis right after it happened in 2014, 2015, right after the genocide. I was working on a different film in the region at the time, and so I sort of shelved it away, and I didn't have the resources or honestly the skill to tell that story how I wanted to. Then in 2018, I, as well as the rest of the world, had moved on from, if we had even heard of the Yazidi cause, we had moved on from it. And then I heard that at the time there's 3,000 plus Yazidis in captivity or otherwise missing. That sort of, relit the spark of this is a story that I want to tell now. I knew that, I'm not Yazidi. I'm not from the region. I have a confusing first name, last name mix, so that, while it seems that it
We
would
can't
open
place
doors,
you, Hasan.
yes, yeah, exactly. So, people, I would go there and they'd think, they'd either start speaking Kurdish or Arabic to me, or they would, just think I was a spy of some sort. So I knew I would have to have some, alternate path into this story. I knew it had to be a story, told by the Yazidi people, and that turned out to be by Mediha. Her and two of her brothers had just returned from captivity.
And how old was Mediha when you met her?
She was 14 and a half when we met her. So she returned right before she turned 14.
So when you meet her, she's without parents, father presumed dead, mother still in captivity.
Yep.
She's 14, looking after two brothers.
Yes, and they're living with their uncle at the time. And she had taken part in a photo workshop run by one of our producers, Annalise Mecca. She was teaching photography to the returning women. And I had been interested for a while with the power dynamic or the power balance between filmmaker and participant way before this project, probably since, the first doc I ever saw was Born into Brothels. And I thought this is clearly a girl, a young woman at the time who could potentially carry a collaboration, because it's a big ask of mutual trust, and to collaborate the way we did, that was going to take work. So I knew I needed someone really incredible. And the first day we met her, or the first day I met her in person, the community and her family had told us that she was taken by ISIS for 4 years, but it wasn't, it was as a house servant of sorts. It was not as what we quickly learned to be as a sex slave or a sabaya from the age 9 to 13. We met her, and she was sitting in the corner of her camper, of her tent. We had met numerous other women and girls who had recently returned. And of course, in most cases, they're shadows of themselves. A lot of them, they did not leave the tent. Some of them are nonverbal. And Mediha, that first day, she had this spark. She had this, she was joking, she was witty, and Tom, you've met her in New York. She's just this incredible young woman who
more composed than people who haven't been through.
Exactly. And so right then I thought, this is someone who could potentially do this. And on day one, she was interested in the cameras and interested in, hey, what are you guys doing? And so it went from, I thought maybe it'd be creative, some kind of transitions in the film, or online material, or interludes. I didn't really know what role her cinematography would play, to her being co-cinematographer, 50% of the film filmed by her, and she just took the narrative and ran with it.
I'm curious, as you got back the footage she was shooting, what was striking to you about her perspective on things?
Yeah, I mean, first, she was so skilled with framing shots and sort of dropping pebbles in slow motion that intuitively she got it, and I think that's from TikTok, Instagram. Like she had these skills. I barely taught her anything, but also the ability of her to reflect on what happened to her. was remarkable. And you see in the film, and even in this, those are her words as she said them. It blew us away, and we got that first batch of footage translated, and it very quickly became, Medea. It became her film and her story. Of course, her people's story, seen through the lens and through the voice of Medea. She could reflect, and her layered sort of processing of her grief at such a young age was remarkable.
I mean, it's one thing to meet someone who seems composed at the outset, but trauma can take lots of layers of processing and take, a long time to come out. Over the long time that you were making the film, where there, did you have to kind of recalibrate along the way as she's also, in the search for her family members, susceptible to different kinds of trauma?
Yeah, we had to, probably from that first batch of footage, we had to recalibrate. We had to slow everything down. We had already made her and her community and her siblings sort of the promise of time that we're not going to film for 3 weeks and talk about sexual enslavement and ISIS and caliphate cubs or child soldiers. We're going to be here as long as it takes. We had that first batch of footage, and then we sat down with her and we said, because her form of dealing with trauma clearly in the film is to speak. And, one of the first lines in the film is, I want to talk about what's happened to me, but I'm not allowed. So when we gave her the camera, and she describes the camera as, it was her only friend. It was a therapist before she knew what a therapist even was. And it was the first time she felt strong. She felt strong. She said something heavy came off of her shoulders. So we knew that, while she was all in, we had to make sure the proper guardrails were in place because, again, she was 14 at the time, 15. We had to, we brought in 2 trauma-informed producers, Annalise and Faranisa. Everything was done. Any sensitive interviews or subject matter were covered with only them and a female translator in the room. We made sure that Medea we had constant workshops of consent and continuous consent, at the end of which she just kept saying, why are you guys now keep asking me why I'm telling my story? This is my story to tell, and I'm going to tell it. So we gave her all the information we could. Once we slowed her down a bit, she gained perspective that, yes, she's speaking into a camera, wandering around the hills of Iraq. But this is, we told her this could reach, thousands and, potentially more people. And she said, yes, that's the point. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she was 14 or 15 when we first met her. How old is she now?
So she just turned 20 last week.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And film premiered a year ago, and it's been making its way around the world in screens. This isn't the kind of film that that streamers are exactly flocking to these days. You've been in partnership with Together Films and doing a very good job with on a kind of more rugged resources, which I think is the way many filmmakers are reaching audiences these days.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you've learned from that experience of connecting with audiences on more limited resources.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the privilege of having a very successful festival run. So while we don't have broadcast or streaming distribution, we've screened in probably close to 40 festivals now, and she's gone to probably 20 festivals, all U.S. based, and it's daunting, all of this. But I will say the turnout for all these festivals and the reaction, and to see her mingling and talking about the cause and her life after the screenings with all of them, it's certainly been a bright spot. That, yeah, as you said, there is a way forward. It's challenging. I've learned what haven't I learned? This is my second film, but my first film we premiered at Slam Dance, and then 3 weeks later, COVID hit, and that's part of the reason I went to Iraq, actually. So it was a silver lining. But that, for a first-time filmmaker, that's where you start your career on the festival trail. And that first film of finding an amazing partner like Together Films, and or hopefully finding an amazing partner. Um, it's yeah, I've learned every aspect of this, and because resources are tight, and uh, we have to hustle. It's taught me a lot more than if I had a massive budget, and that's how I made my first film, on a shoestring budget, selling my blood to pay for groceries. Because of that, I had to learn how to edit. I had to learn how to produce, and that carried over into this. So because we're running a grassroots campaign, it's also forced me to learn a lot about this industry.
So, what has this year been like for Mediha getting out there, and where is she at in her journey now? What is her main message?
Yeah, so she lives full time in New York City now. She goes to school. Will finish her GED if she puts down Instagram in about 16 months. She wants to be a human rights lawyer. So she has, as she describes it, the camera sort of.
When you first met her, she didn't speak English.
She didn't speak English. I used to be an English teacher in Thailand, so I spoke this baby English, and we would just exchange voice notes on WhatsApp 24/7. So that was sort of the foundation of her. We had translators early on as well. But yeah, she lives in the city. She calls herself a city girl, and now she just moved to Brooklyn, so she's a Brooklyn girl. She has, her first crush. She takes the subway. She was at the UN yesterday. I went from hearing from her, 30 times a day. I live in New York City as well. 30 times a day I used to hear from her, and now it's like once every other day, which is it's great. But there's definitely a huge space in my everyday life. Yeah, she's absolutely thriving, and she sits in at every screening at every film festival. So that's the Ibeline team was, Benjamin was explaining that
She watches the
it
whole
was a
film.
source of trauma, healing from trauma, and that's exactly what it is for Dia. She said the first time she got a camera, it made her feel powerful, and now she sees herself on screen and other people watching it in California, Florida, and she said it makes her feel powerful. So she sits in, 3-4 times a week at every film festival, which is a lot.
Not many filmmakers
No.
would do that. And you described, maybe the Yazidi cause had a brief moment of attention that has been eclipsed by other tragedies in the world. Where is that issue now? And for people who campaign around it, what is their focus?
Yeah, so it's the 10-year anniversary was this past August, which is shocking to me as well. And I've been
The
covering
10-year
it,
anniversary
of the genocide. Still, as you saw in that trailer, 2,700 Yazidis remain in captivity or otherwise missing. The film also, briefly touches on the fact that the mass graves that the Yazidis were put in, none of them have been uncovered. So even if they do know their loved ones are dead, they have no way to recover their bodies. All the issues covered in the film are not only not solved, they are in every case much worse than they were. And as Medea says it, yes, the genocide ended in 2015, but really the genocide is just as bad today as it was back then. So part of this campaign, of course, is to refocus some semblance of a international spotlight on what happened to them. But part of our impact campaign is to somehow kick the wheels and get the rescues going again. Aid these women who are trying to come back with these Yazidi women in captivity who have children by ISIS. And I won't give away the film, but something happens in the film where those rescues are no longer taking place. So we'd like to kickstart those again. Yeah, it's been 10 years, and I understand that the documentary world moves on quickly. We as a society move on quickly from these atrocities, and hopefully this helps to give them some semblance of a spotlight again.
So for my last question, I'd love to hear about, in this experience of showing the film, what you've seen the film do to to help that cause. Whether it's been screenings for influential figures, or making a general population more aware, or I mean, obviously there's the effect on Mediha herself and the strength she takes from it. What other ripple effects have you seen come out of it?
So yeah, we didn't. Of course, we made a film that we wanted to make a film that causes change, raises awareness. But we didn't. The film that never talks about any politics. It's in a region that, whether it's the Turks and the Kurds and the Iraqis. We never talked about it because Medea never talked about it. Medea never talked about making policy change. We never talked about making policy change. Yet, the film manages to touch on all of those subjects. And because of that, so what we've shown in consulates and embassies around the world, we will show in the Iraqi for the Iraqi president's office. So it is sort of, the gears of change are starting to creak. However, it's a slow process, and perhaps not a fruitless process, but a frustrating process. Every time we have every film experiences this, but something happens to take the oxygen out of the room. So if there were to be an ounce of bandwidth for an indie Yazidi film, then it's sucked out of the room. So progress is slow, but it is happening, and I think wider than that, Mediha receives hundreds of DMs, not just from Yazidi girls, not just from girls from the Middle East, girls who have gone through similar things around the world, and they come up to her after the screenings as well. That thank you for sharing your story. It's inspired me to share my story as well. So those messages are incredible for her and her sort of mental health, but also it shows that while we work behind the scenes to try to make political change and change in Yazidi
change
policy,
happens on individual levels
exactly,
of viewers,
and that's certainly going on in the background as well.
Remind me the release of this film in the UK, the details of it.
Sure. So we officially released today in the UK, and then on December 11th for World Human Rights Day in collaboration with Picture House.
So please do look out for Mediha in theaters. I want to thank Hasan Oswald.
Thank you.
Our third film is about the challenging relationship between China and Taiwan. It's called Invisible Nation, referring to Taiwan, and it's an eye-opening primer on the island's complicated history. For years, Taiwan has been blocked by China from being recognized as an independent country in settings such as the United Nations, the Olympics, and the World Health Organization. A key figure in the film is Tsai Ing-wen, who is Taiwan's first woman president, serving from 2016 until this year when she reached her term limits. President Tsai has long been a passionate advocate for Taiwan's independence. In recent years, China has grown more threatening. Many observers worry that China will attempt an invasion of Taiwan the way Russia did with Ukraine. Filmmaker Vanessa has lived in both China and Taiwan and speaks fluent Mandarin. She worked closely with collaborators in the region, including producer Sylvia Feng. 2 days before we talked at Documentary Spotlight, I joined Vanessa for an event at Britain's House of Lords, where she discussed her film with policymakers and journalists. Here's our conversation.
Vanessa, you had previously made a film about the U.S. ambassador to China, so you've had experience in this region before, but your experience goes back even further to being a student. Can you briefly describe your history living in China and Taiwan?
Absolutely. And now this film is out, I can share honestly that I think it all started with the year I lived in Taiwan, 1995-96, because that was the year they became a democracy. They held their first direct presidential elections. And although I had been a student in China first and fallen in love with it, that's where I first learned the language. So people say I have a Beijing accent on my Chinese. I was totally surprised that China started firing missiles at all of us on the island to prevent those elections from happening, to stop Taiwan becoming a democracy, because in their mind, it would lead toward desire for independence. And so I borrowed a Chinese language teacher's camera, and I ran around. It was the first time I ever used a camera, filming Li Denghui's inauguration weekend. And actually,
Back in 1995.
96.
96, yeah.
And it was in that footage is in the film. So I changed my life because of that. I knew the U.S. sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait, but late. President Clinton wasn't really trying to deter the actual missiles, because it was after the missiles, but to send a signal to China that the U.S. intended to defend Taiwan. But the People's Liberation Army in China, they couldn't even detect the existence of the aircraft carriers. So that was a pivotal moment, after which
There was China's military capabilities in 1996 weren't what they are today.
exactly. And that started that process of change. And I said, really, I have no idea what's going on in the U.S. foreign policy and what our fingerprints are on this situation. I had studied all I could in starting in high school and then in college, and to better understand the region. But Taiwan's story wasn't told. And when I went to work at the Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank, to better understand this, the focus was engaging China economically and hoping for political liberalization. But in fact, after Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, that idea went out the window, and Taiwan is in a much more vulnerable position. So yes, it all started as a student, and then when Obama became president, I was so excited and inspired. I thought it would be an excellent window into the diplomatic relationship if I could follow his U.S. ambassador to China, and that was the first film.
So this current film, Invisible Nation, I think you started really thinking about around 2016 when President Tsai was elected into power. Part of her campaign was really to assert Taiwan's independence, while other politicians were contemplating different paths, like trying to be more accommodating to China, 2 different philosophies about how to exist as a small island country next to that empire. So what were you, when you got going on this project, what were you envisioning it, and how did that adapt over time?
Well, that's exactly right. I finished the first film and was on the road with it, festivals and all of that, in 2015, but tracking developments in Taiwan and thinking they might elect their first female president in 2016, January. So I joined this international delegation to monitor that the elections were free and fair, which I think could be a documentary in and of itself, that experience. But I worked with a local film crew, and we were in the crowd when President Tsai won. And it was completely exciting, kind of overwhelming, very historic feeling. And the screen behind the president-elect, when she was up there, was blaring, "We are Taiwanese." And I think that's really been a development I've learned since making this film, that came hand in hand with democratization, the sense of identity. And in fact, the idea of independence is, you're right, by her second term, toward the end of it, after all of the global developments that did happen, which I can talk about, but President Tsai interviewed and would say, no, we don't need a formal declaration of independence. We are already de facto independent. We're a de facto country. The lack of official diplomatic recognition from the major countries, nevertheless, harms Taiwan and is something she's negotiated carefully. So in her first term, and we capture some of this in the film, she does. She's the first president to really speak up for Taiwan without saying, we're making a declaration of independence, but we exist. We have autonomy. the People's Republic of China has never controlled us. We are a democracy. We would like to be supported by the international community.
Now, I think, for many people with everything happening in the world, it's like, Taiwan is, maybe off their radar, and what that tension is with China, as you explain in the film, has complex layers. So, so I think one of the services that the film does is, in a concise and informative way, help bring some clarity for people. But can you kind of describe where Taiwan is at today? I mean, I said in my introduction that there are people credibly worry about an invasion from China. Can you elaborate on why that's a worry?
Yes, and thank you for your praise, because that was one of the serious challenges in telling Taiwan's story at all, even with access to their president and people in her administration and people in society, heavy metal rock stars, all of that, because the strength with which the People's Republic of China has controlled the narrative. So basically, Taiwan's voice is absent. People assume Taiwan is part of China. And that, as you said in the introduction, exists in the case of the World Health Assembly, the United Nations, the Interpol, all major international organizations.
Taiwan, for instance, does not have a seat in the United Nations.
Yes, and that is something. So basically, the big challenge was just the facts of their existence, the truth of their history, because people don't know. Even people from Taiwan, the film has really been connecting with the diaspora because people feel unseen and heard wherever they are if they're from Taiwan. That confusion between Taiwan and Thailand is real and it exists. And when we finally were working in the edit in Taipei with a Taiwanese team, and we had a screening room where we could invite the community in and test for feedback, that's where we started to find the balance, because it's not a biopic about President Tsai. She would never have agreed to that. And that's not how she is. She's very much of a team person that always wanted more than just her as the focus of the film. And it's not a history movie. We're not giving you A, B, C, D, the entire history of Taiwan. But we have to give you enough so you understand the stakes today, and you understand, as you're saying, the urgency and this direness really now, because if China gets away with this narrative of, as Putin can try to do with Ukraine, they've always been our territory, they're a part of us, and therefore international community stay out and we can do what we want here, then Taiwan is in deep trouble. If people can understand that there is a true history to Taiwan that's separate from the People's Republic of China, then if China attempts an invasion, it's an international war crime. And so we've been trying to sound the alarm bells about this, because we do have time to deter this invasion, I think, if we can get the international community finding a way to support Taiwan, which is part of what was discussed when we were in the UK Parliament.
So this is 2 days ago. You were invited to show some clips of film at the House of Lords. Credit to Think Film Impact Production for helping to make that event happen. And I got to attend that on Wednesday, and it struck me that President Tsai herself, there are places that she can't travel to. She can't be invited into certain diplomatic settings because it would upset China, and China would push back on anyone who is inviting her in. But your film has the ability to travel into places that that she can't go, and that other Taiwanese leaders can't go. And yeah, I wonder if you can reflect on, you know, that ability for this film to take a message that that human beings can't carry.
I love that idea, and I think you articulate it so well. We basically can represent Taiwan's story and do have President Tsai's voice in the film. And as you said, it can go. It can go to the German Parliament. We've screened in the Reichstag. We were just in the UK Parliament. Yik K. Leung, right here with Think Film, was there, and they did set it up, and thanks to all of you. We are looking at the EU Parliament, but we had to time that out so as not to offend China, because if we did back-to-back UK Parliament, EU Parliament, then that might upset or, you know, provoke them. So we're walking the same fine line that Taiwan is trying to walk. It's a delicate balance, and that's also the kind of challenge for policymakers is what can you do? What angle do you have to give Taiwan more of a voice, and trade, economics? It's generally
Without triggering a backlash
without
of China being upset.
exactly without triggering a backlash. Yeah, I think I used that analogy about the anaconda in the chandelier that Perry Link came up with to describe the Chinese Communist Party and how you never know when they will pounce. And that's why we censor ourselves first, so as to avoid those red lines. But I really think that the world's democracies and other countries can learn from Taiwan. Like, having their voice it's such an important voice of resilience and inspiration and truth in the face of a right-wing backlash that's happening really globally now. Thank you, United States. No, thank you. And we're really in danger of constant lies and disinformation and misinformation spreading everywhere. So Taiwan is a bright light, and I really hope we can find a way to come together for it and never see it extinguished.
With a couple minutes left, I want to go back to President Tsai. Can you talk about the significance of her being elected as a woman, the first woman president in Taiwan, and what perspective you think that she brought to that job?
Yes, and to put it in context, when I began the film, the United States almost elected their first female president in 2016, and instead we ended up with Trump. And when we're now out on the road with the film, the United States again almost elected a first female president, and now we really have Trump. And why does that matter? Well, first I'll talk about President Tsai because I think she is unique. And when she lost in 2012, part of the analysis was maybe they overemphasized the idea of being a woman president. And so it did become more of a conversation about Taiwan's autonomy, right to self-determination, as you said, and she won on that. And she continued to stand up for Taiwan because, in fact, those 2 terms she served were highly significant in terms of events and relationship with China. The speech that Xi Jinping makes in 2019 is the first in 40 years to the people of Taiwan. He did not renounce the use of force. The protests in Hong Kong that were year-long and very peaceful, all of that Taiwan was watching because Deng Xiaoping in 1978 came up with this one country, 2 systems idea. It was always intended for Taiwan. They were just testing it on Hong Kong. But you can see now how that test went. Not so well for the people of Hong Kong. In fact, when we were in the parliament, that's when Jimmy Lai and many other the activists, democracy activists in Hong Kong, they're now put in jail. The national security law that China used to crack down on all of them is extreme and very, very upsetting. And then you had COVID, and then you had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So all of this President Tsai was dealing with while at the same time being one of the most brave presidents in terms of strengthening their democracy and taking policy decisions that no president had done before her, whether that was the same-sex marriage passing or transitional justice with their authoritarian past. That's the other thing. Maybe years from now, because I'm not kidding, I seriously think we're in danger in the United States of losing our democracy. The plans that Trump and Elon Musk have for the United States, they're going to dismantle everything we've built. They're going to send us back really far. So the lesson from Taiwan of how do you transition from an authoritarian dictatorship to democracy is also really important.
Maybe lessons we'll need.
Maybe lessons we'll need.
At some point.
Yeah.
It's a film that we can all learn a lot from. Thank you very much to Vanessa.
Thank you so much,
Hope.
Tom. Thank you. Thank you.
Our final film is Skywalker's A Love Story that follows two daredevils who practice the extreme hobby of climbing to the top of skyscrapers to take jaw-dropping photos and videos. We follow the couple, Ivan and Angela, as they attempt their most risky climb to the top of the second tallest building in the world in Kuala Lumpur. They're hoping the feat might repair their romantic relationship that's been under stress. If you watch the trailer linked in our show notes, you'll see it's a death-defying act. The director Jeff Zimbalist has been making films for over 20 years. He was joined in London by his producer Tamir Ardon from XYZ Films. I started by asking Jeff, what was the scariest part of making this film?
Oh, every step was scary. I mean, I was frightened by people getting hurt, aside from myself. I mean, our biggest concern was safety, not just our subjects, but our crew, and then also our viewers. You know, we wanted to avoid copycats. All of that scared me. We did go with our big cameras up to the flat roofs, which in some cases were way higher than when I was a rooftopper when I was younger. That was very frightening, but we had a safety protocol, and that suggested that we had to leave the skywalkers, the rooftoppers, at that flat roof. And if they would go up on a crane or on a spire, they would do the shooting themselves.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back. You started, I think you first met Ivan and Angela around 2016.
That's right, yeah.
And began the project independently. Talk about, how you got this off the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, a quick step back from that is that I had done some amateur rooftopping in my teens and 20s. I didn't even know it was a thing. I just called it trespassing or ninja missioning with my buddies. And it had a deep impact on me. And I was able to sort of face my fear on my own terms and figure out at that young age who I wanted to be on my own terms. And as I sort of took off my proverbial ninja balaclava and put on my journalist cap and started telling stories, I was looking for something that resonated as deeply as my experience. Mostly what I found for many years was just reckless daredevils risking their lives for likes on social media, which did not resonate for me. Flash forward to 2016, 2015, and Angela Nicolau burst on the scene. She's the first female rooftopper. She sang in her caption, she doesn't want to be like the guys, she wants to do her own thing. And you could tell, I mean, she was her own wardrobe department. She was using the architecture to compose these beautiful images. She cared about light. When she talked about her influences, it was Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat and Warhol. It wasn't Logan Paul or Jake Paul or the Kardashians. And so I was intrigued. I reached out to her, and she told me that she was raised in a traveling circus and that she considered rooftopping her version of the modern day circus. So I was even more intrigued. And then she introduced me to Vanya, who she presented as her competitor or her rival. But it didn't take a genius to see that under the surface there was a courtship bubbling. And that's where the seed was planted of like, oh my God, can we tell a love story on top of the world? Could we use extreme climbing as a metaphor for romantic trust and courage? And that was what I needed to understand what the genre of this thing was. It wasn't just a world. We now knew what the story was within it. Did some shooting over about 2.5 years, put a sizzle together, and Tamir and I had been old friends. First person I showed the sizzle to.
So Tamir, with your company XYZ Films, what were your first impressions of this material?
I mean, we've been dying to work with Jeff for many years. Like we've been flirting with a couple projects, never sort of got over the hump. He presented this one to us, and right away it became a no-brainer for us. I mean, a no-brainer in the sense that it was a huge risk, but one that we felt
Meaning
confident
you
in.
have to not have a brain to go up there.
Just one that we felt that there would be an audience desire to see something of this nature, something that had a sort of a rich story behind it, but
Well, for
also
sure you don't see a sizzle reel like that every day.
No, it took about 10 minutes to sit down and just relax after watching the sizzle reel. Then I sent it company wide and said, this is really something we need to consider.
But there's a whole
diving
other
into.
risk factor to this that is beyond the average documentary. How are you processing that?
Well, we processed it in the way that we just knew a film like this wasn't going to get made going directly to a buyer. It was something that you needed financiers, producers to be a little bit more wild, wild cowboy-esque about it, which is kind of what we pride ourselves on doing at XYZ. And so the safety protocols that Jeff mentioned, where we don't put the climbers in positions where they're going to be distracted by our cameras being around or feel that they need to overperform in a certain way, other than doing something that they've been naturally doing for many, many years. And then obviously getting all the families to agree. We had everyone sign releases, not just the principals, but their grandmothers, parents, siblings. Everyone kind of understood what they were getting into and that they wanted to sort of bring this more to light than through Instagram and TikTok and all the other social media channels.
So, Jeff, you and I talked a few months ago on Pure Nonfiction, episode 196.
Unbelievable.
And you described that in the course of filming, you were trying to assure Ivan and Angela that the film did not depend on them reaching the top of this building. You said to them that you thought the real stakes of the story were they going to be able to trust each other in their relationship. I mean, when I hear you describe that, it feels like like a filmmaker as therapist kind of conversation. I know you've described to me that your mom was a therapist, so it's not that far from your own life experience. But I mean, can you talk about that role of filmmaker therapist in working particularly with your participants in this film?
Yeah, I mean, they're young and finding themselves, right? This is a key juncture in their life transition from, leaving home and just deciding what they wanted their professional life to be, and they're entrepreneurs at the same time. I know from other projects that when you tell subjects, don't do anything for the cameras that you wouldn't do otherwise, that they're all going to nod and say, of course. But subconsciously, the presence of cameras, as we've all studied in journalism school, affects the way people behave. And so, the only thing I knew how to do was just consistently have the conversation with them, like you said, where I would reassure them and remind them that even if they failed at whatever the climactic climb was, in this case, the Merdeka, that was not a fail in our eyes, that we felt this was not a story about the fear of falling from heights, that much more so this is a story about the fear of falling in love. And so we just kept redirecting them back to the relational dynamics, that your climbs are a metaphor. I even had conversations with them about mixed bag endings and how I kind of prefer mixed bag endings. So maybe we fail at our external mission, but you choose to trust each other at the end of this journey. And that's what I think will be the resolve, the satisfaction of the audience. They'd never done long format storytelling, so there was a constant collaboration where they're sort of teaching us about how they shoot and how they approach short form, and we're teaching them how we approach long form. And the big thing with long form is structure, storytelling structure. So they learned a lot. I mean, Angela picked up really quickly how to capture the stuff that they would usually leave on the cutting room floor. So the awkward moments, the negotiations of courage and fear, how they improv with each other. The silences, she got really good at that. And then Ivan is an unbelievable drone artist. Most of the drone work that you saw in that trailer was done by himself. He'll take the remote out of his pocket. He'll schedule a move. He'll pick Angela up. He'll put the remote back in his pocket, pick Angela up, put her back down. He'll program a different move and do it all over again. And so we had multiple takes of a lot of their acrobatic stunts. And that was just a constant conversation throughout the process, that I'm rooting for you guys, but I don't want it to be something that, that we're all regretting happened here. There's a metaphor in the film Angela's parents were trapeze artists. And in the trapeze, you have the flyer who leads the couple towards the skies, the ambition, and then you've got the catcher who brings them back down to earth and grounds them. And we were always the catcher. Like we kept telling them to do less, and often they did not listen.
So the film came out on Netflix in the summer. This climb on Merdeka is, which happened in 2022, I think, was a big one for them. Where are they now in their careers?
Well, they live in New York City now because we were able to secure them a 2-year work visa. They literally showed up.
What's their work?
Well, a lot of different things. Angela's
Watch out, World Trade Center?
No, well, that's the thing. That's the rub, unfortunately, is they can't climb in the States because they don't want to do anything to jeopardize their visa. But when they were at Tribeca for the IMAX premiere, they were looking around like kids in a candy shop up at the city, like that one. So maybe a couple of days before they have to leave the country, they'll go on like a crazy climb scout. But she's an incredibly talented artist. She's doing her own art. What is it, like with a kitty cat type of?
Yeah, she has a kitty series that's
Yeah,
doing really well.
that's
It's
doing
very
really well.
Warhol inspired.
Yeah, and Ivan's doing some professional drone work, and he's also an aspiring DJ. So they've got their interests outside of this. They still love the passion of climbing, but they realize that it's something that is,
It's a young person's game.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
I get more and more vertigo the older I get. Yeah.
So, I mean, Jeff, you have a prolific career. In fact, the last year that this came out, you also had a film about Norman Mailer, very historic film. It kind of shows your range. Of all the films you've made, this one feels to me like it stands out in a special way. I wonder how it feels to you.
Oh, I appreciate that, Tom. Yeah, I think the big thing I took away from it is that I got a little cocky, that I felt I understood what the arc of the story might be early on. It was true verite. It was shot over 6.5 years. So I know from other films that I need to be open-minded and let things evolve, but I had this sense that, Angela, we're going to go back to my mom as the therapist here. My analysis of her was that she had an abandonment fear based on her dad leaving her when she was young, and that we were going to stick around and watch her journey to ultimately choose to trust Ivan, and that would be the end of the film. It turned out to be, I think, a more insightful reflection on what it takes to make a relationship work, that we saw that he was her catcher, as it were, in the flyer catcher metaphor. He was her rock and she was the star, but then they flipped roles a couple of times, especially on the Merdeka and the climactic climb. And I thought that was a much more interesting way of looking at what our roles are in relationships, that we all have to be the rock sometimes and the star sometimes. We all have to be the flyer at times and the catcher at times. So I love that they taught me something about relationships during that process. The other thing I would say is that, I've worked on a lot of projects where you have these morally compromised protagonists, and there's a lot of deceit and betrayal and abandonment, and we're surrounded by those stories all the time. And naturally, we're cautious around others and trusting others as a result. And in this case, this was a story where we could hopefully encourage people to lean in a little more, and especially when it feels like the most dangerous thing to do, take that leap of faith of trusting somebody else, even when your life is in someone else's hands. And I feel like that's very much what we need, to unite across our differences. So I was glad to put something out into the world that was encouraging in that way.
I mean, to me, you're talking about trust. You had trusted Jeff with an early investment in this film. Jeff had described in our podcast that they'd spent 3 years filming before the Merdeka climb, which becomes the main point of the film, even came up. What was keeping you going in your trust of Jeff to make this project all it could be?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, he's got an incredible pedigree as a filmmaker. So, I mean, it wasn't hard to understand where he was going to be going with this project. And, we were obviously involved pretty intimately throughout some of the early assemblies and seeing what was sort of occurring and where the storylines were going. I mean, honestly, I think one of my biggest fears was that they were going to break up, and not that there was going to be some deadly, accident, and what was that going to do to the story. So no, we felt fairly confident in that the fact that regardless of what the journey ended up, where it ended up going, we were going to end up with something really, really rich and wonderful, and something that you could take a lot from, as well as enjoy as a sort of, thriller-esque documentary.
So, Jeff, for my last question, I mean, sometimes when we watch a trailer, like trailers have all the best scenes in the film. That is not, this is just scratching the surface of the kind of jaw-dropping, teeth-clenching moments in this film. But I wonder, for storytelling, did the kind of awesomeness of the imagery become something you have to pace out in the film?
I knew we had enough spectacle to reach a viewer that wanted spectacle. So I think was much less concerned with how much do we pile on the spectacle where and how do we disperse it across the 100 minutes than I was on how is what we're watching within the spectacle advancing the internal journey, right? Their storyline. I've done projects on other extreme athletes and athletes in general who say, if I die doing what I love, I'm at peace with that. And I don't identify with that. Alex Honnold in Free Solo, they do a brain scan. He doesn't have the fear center that the rest of us do. So obviously I can't identify with that. But these guys are afraid of dying. And she has panic attacks on camera during the film. So humanizing these acts and watching where they draw these, what their thresholds are for when it's pushing through the fear is going to reveal their full potential and have them evolve in a way that is meaningful versus when is it just stupid and reckless and for naught. We chose the climbs based on how they advanced those thought processes for them, for the Skywalkers, and also with the climax, like we needed a climb that wasn't necessarily the biggest spectacle of the film, but in which they had a pivot in the way they treated each other, where we saw an advancement, a transformation in that arc. And luckily we got that during the World Cup.
So Skywalker's A Love Story is on Netflix now. You missed your chance to see it on IMAX last summer. That was a great experience. Thank you very much to Jeff Zimbalist and Tamir Ardon.
I want to thank all the filmmakers who joined us for Documentary Spotlight in London. You can hear 2 other conversations from this event on our last episode, where we discuss the films Eno and the Remarkable Life of Ebeline. If you'd like to follow what we're doing, please subscribe to our newsletter, Doc Voices, written by Bella Racklin. You'll find it on Substack. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.